Paranasal air sinuses. Now there are 4 types of paranasal air sinuses are there in the skull. These are frontal air sinus, which is present inside the frontal bone of the skull. Then the maxillary air sinus, which is present in the maxillary bone. Then the sphenoidal air sinus, which is present in the sphenoid bone of the skull. And the ethmoidal air sinuses, anterior ethmoidal air sinus, middle ethmoidal air sinus, and posterior ethmoidal air sinus, which are present in the ethmoid bone of the skull. So there are 4 air sinuses: frontal air sinus, maxillary air sinus, sphenoidal air sinus, and ethmoidal air sinus. You can remember it by FEMS mnemonic. F for frontal, E for ethmoidal, M for maxillary, and S for sphenoidal. These are the paranasal air sinuses which are present around our nasal cavity. Name of the openings of middle in the middle meatus. Remember these air sinuses, paranasal air sinuses, their openings are present in the middle meatus of the nose. In the lateral wall of the nose, there are 3 turbinates or meatuses are present. These turbinates are named superior meatus, middle meatus, and inferior meatus. These meatuses are also known as turbinates: superior turbinate, middle turbinate, and inferior turbinate. And the space beneath these turbinates, the space beneath the superior turbinate is known as superior concha. Space beneath the middle turbinate is known as middle concha, and space beneath the inferior turbinate is known as inferior concha. Now the openings in the middle meatus. Middle meatus is the space present beneath the middle concha or middle turbinate. Opening of frontal air sinus is present in the middle meatus through frontonasal duct. Through frontonasal duct. In the middle meatus, there is a ethmoidal infundibulum. Just above this ethmoidal infundibulum, opening of frontal air sinus through frontonasal duct, opening of frontal air sinus is present. Frontal air sinus open in the middle meatus of the nose. Then opening of the maxillary air sinus is present in the lower part of hiatus semilunaris. There is a structure which is present in the middle meatus of the nose known as hiatus semilunaris. And the maxillary air sinus. Maxillary air sinus opens in the lower part of the hiatus semilunaris. Then opening of the middle ethmoidal air sinus on the bulla ethmoidalis in the middle meatus of the nose. So what are the openings of the middle meatus? Opening of the frontal air sinus, opening of the middle maxillary air sinus, and opening of the middle ethmoidal air sinus. Opening of frontal air sinus through frontonasal duct above frontal ethmoidal infundibulum. Opening of the maxillary air sinus. Maxillary air sinus is also known as antrum of Highmore. What it is known as antrum of Highmore, after the name of the anatomist who invented this sinus, maxillary air sinus, and it opens in the middle meatus of the nose, in the lower part of the hiatus semilunaris. Opening of the middle ethmoidal air sinus on the bulla ethmoidalis, in the middle meatus of the nose. So frontal air sinus through frontonasal duct above the ethmoidal infundibulum. Opening of the anterior ethmoidal air sinus. The ethmoidal air sinus is one of the air sinuses. There are four air sinuses: frontal, ethmoidal, maxillary, and sphenoidal. So ethmoidal air sinuses are anterior ethmoidal air sinus, मिडिल इथमोइडल एयर साइनस एंड पोस्टीरियर इथमोइडल एयर साइनस। कौन कौन से एयर साइनस होते हैं इथमोइडल में? एंटीरियर, मिडिल एंड पोस्टीरियर इथमोइडल एयर साइनस। ओपनिंग ऑफ द एंटीरियर इथमोइडल एयर साइनस into the ethmoidal infundibulum of middle meatus, ethmoidal infundibulum. Posterior ethmoidal air sinus opens into the superior meatus in the lateral wall of nose. Lateral wall of the nose में मैंने आपको बताया कि there are 3 turbinates और 3 meatuses, superior, middle and inferior. जो superior meatus और middle meatus रहता है बच्चों, ये पार्ट रहता है ethmoid bone का, और जो inferior meatus रहता है, it is an independent bone. So posterior ethmoidal air sinus opens into the superior meatus. Superior meatus is the space present beneath the superior concha in the lateral wall of the nose. And posterior ethmoidal air sinus opens into the superior meatus in the lateral wall of nose. And opening of inferior meatus of nose is of nasolacrimal duct. हमने lacrimal apparatus पढ़ा था. लेक्राइमल एपरेटस में नेजोलेक्राइमल डक्ट पड़ी थी. नेजोलेक्राइमल डक्ट जो टीयर को ड्रेन करती है, and it runs downwards, outwards and backwards, and it opens into the inferior meatus of the nose. So it is the only opening in the inferior meatus of the nose, and it is the nasolacrimal duct. Is it clear up to now? I think. Now sphenoidal air sinus. Sphenoidal air sinus opens into the sphenoethmoidal recess. There is a recess known as sphenoethmoidal recess above the superior concha. This recess, sphenoethmoidal recess, is present above the superior concha. Beneath the superior concha, superior meatus is present. But above the superior concha, sphenoethmoidal recess is present. And in sphenoethmoidal recess, sphenoidal air sinus opens. So where does the sphenoidal air sinus opens? It opens into the sphenoethmoidal recess above the superior concha. What is antrum of high mode? Maxillary sinus is also called as antrum of high mode. It is the largest paranasal air sinus. अब एक पॉइंट नोट करिएगा आप, only bone in the body made up of totally spongy bone is nasal, inferior nasal concha. What is spongy bone? There are 2 types of bones, compact bone and cancellous bone. Cancellous bone is also known as spongy bone. So only bone in the body which is made up of, totally made up of, solely made up of spongy bone is inferior nasal concha, which is an independent bone, and it is counted independently in our 206 bones. The inferior nasal concha, while superior nasal concha and middle nasal concha, they are the part of ethmoid bone. The paranasal sinuses are actually cavities found in the interior of maxilla, maxillary air sinus, frontal, in the frontal bone, frontal air sinus, in the sphenoid bone, sphenoidal air sinus, and within the ethmoid bone, ethmoidal air sinus. So they are found within the bones. They are lined by mucoperiosteum and filled with air. They are lined by mucoperiosteum. Mucoperiosteum से लाइन रहती हैं ये, and filled with air. Air से ये filled रहती हैं. Therefore, they are known as paranasal air sinuses. इनके एक्सरे भी जो होते हैं वो पेरानेजल एयर साइनस का व्यू अलग रहता है, वाटर्स व्यू रहता है, वो हम एग्जाम में देते हैं आपको इनका एक्सरे पेरानेजल साइनसेस. They communicate with the nasal cavity through relatively small apertures. मैंने बताया आपको, they open in the lateral wall of the nose through very small apertures in the lateral wall of nose. Nose आप पढ़ेंगे, उसमें lateral wall of nose में superior nasal concha, inferior nasal concha, middle nasal concha पढ़ेंगे. उनके नीचे नीचे स्पेसेस रहती है, उनको मिएटसेस बोलते हैं. सुपीरियर, मिडिल एंड इंफीरियर नेजल मिएटसेस उसमें ओपन होती है. ओपनिंग्स ऑफ लेटरल वॉल ऑफ नोज, ये ध्यान से पढ़िए. स्फिनोइडल एयर साइनस ओपन्स इनटू द स्फिनोएथमोइडल रिसेस. What is sphenoethmoidal recess? It is a recess present just above the superior nasal concha. Posterior ethmoidal air sinuses open in the superior meatus. Superior meatus is the space present beneath the superior nasal concha. Middle ethmoidal air sinuses open on bulla ethmoidalis in the middle meatus, which is present below. Middle meatus is space beneath the middle concha. तो ये 3 होगा. स्फिनोइडल एयर साइनस, मिडिल इथमोइडल एयर साइनस, पोस्टीरियर इथमोइडल एयर साइनस. एम आई गोइंग फास्ट? थोड़ा आप आपके अंगूठे से बता दीजिए. सबको अनम्यूट करा है, थोड़ा आप बता दीजिए. मैं फास्ट जा रहा हूँ क्या?
सर.
नो सर.
नो सर.
Sphenoidal air sinus opens into sphenoethmoidal recess. Lateral wall of nose is very important for you students. Lateral wall में openings of the paranasal air sinuses भी रहती है. Lateral wall of nose का blood supply भी important है. Lateral wall of nose का nerve supply भी important है. तो lateral wall of nose में paranasal air sinuses की openings रहती है. Sphenoidal air sinus opens into sphenoethmoidal recess. Posterior ethmoidal air sinus opens in superior meatus. Middle ethmoidal air sinuses open on the bulla ethmoidalis in middle meatus. In the lateral wall of nasal cavity, shelf-like projections called conchae are seen. Underlying the conchae, recesses or meatuses are present. In the superior nasal concha, sphenoethmoidal recess is present in which opening of sphenoidal air sinus is present. In the superior nasal concha, underlying superior nasal meatus is present in which opening of posterior ethmoidal air sinus is present. In the middle nasal concha, underlying middle nasal meatus is present. There is opening of frontal air sinus, anterior and middle ethmoidal air sinus, and maxillary air sinus is there. Underlying the inferior nasal concha, inferior nasal meatus is present in which opening of nasolacrimal duct is present. Now this is the diagram. You can draw it from your book. This This is the superior nasal concha and the space beneath the superior nasal meatus. इसमें opening of posterior ethmoidal air sinus. This is the middle nasal concha and this is the middle nasal meatus opening beneath the middle nasal concha, and this is the inferior nasal concha and opening beneath the nasal middle inferior nasal concha is inferior nasal meatus, in which the only opening is present, opening of nasolacrimal duct. See, in the middle nasal meatus, there are opening of frontal air sinus, maxillary air sinus, opening of middle ethmoidal air sinus, opening of pharyngotympanic ट्यूब तो nasopharynx में है बेटा. So this diagram you can draw, you can vary ये frontonasal duct के through middle meatus में frontal air sinus की भी opening है. This is the opening of frontal air sinus in the middle meatus of the nose. This is the diagram showing opening of various paranasal air sinuses and nasolacrimal duct in the lateral wall of the nose. And this is the opening of the sphenoidal air sinus above the superior nasal concha in the sphenoethmoidal recess. Clear? हाथ ऊंचा करके बताइए आप मेरे को, थंब रेस करिए आपका. Functions of paranasal air sinuses are they make the skull lighter. अपना skull बहुत heavy रहता है, paranasal air sinuses के कारण they make the skull lighter. They add resonance to the voice. अब सभी की voice अलग अलग रहती है. They make resonance. They add resonance or timbre to the voice. They humidify the air. हम जो inspire और expire करते हैं, air को उसको humidification provide करता है. And they provide adult shape to the facial skeleton. Location, boundaries and drainage of maxillary air sinus. Maxillary air sinus is the largest air sinus. It is pyramid shaped cavity occupying the body of maxilla. अब हमें इसके बारे में ज्यादा डिस्क्रिप्शन में नहीं जाना है. दूसरा टॉपिक हम टेरिगोपेलेटाइन गैंग्लियन पढ़ेंगे. Because the time is limited, तो मैं just read कर रहा हूँ उसको. Its apex extends towards and often into the zygomatic bone. Its base is formed by lateral wall of the nasal cavity. The roof is formed by floor of orbit, and maxillary sinusitis is common because its drainage is very atypical, है ना? Particularly those of first two molars often produce conical elevation in the floor of and may even perforate it, and it drains into middle meatus in the posterior part of hiatus semilunaris. इसकी opening है maxillary air sinus की. The maxillary air sinus is most commonly infected, causing maxillary sinusitis. बेटा sinus की inflammation को क्या बोलेंगे? Sinusitis. Inflammation of sinus is known as sinusitis because the ostium means opening of the sinus. Ostium for drainage is located near the roof. Maxillary sinus का ostium of drainage is located near the roof, which is an unfavorable location for the natural drainage. Frontal air sinus. अब ये देखिए आप टेरिगोपेलेटाइन गैंग्लियन. लोकेशन, रूट्स एंड डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ टेरिगोपेलेटाइन गैंग्लियन. अभी तक आपने इसी से ऑप्टिक गैंग्लियन, सबमैंडिबुलर गैंग्लियन और कौन सा गैंग्लियन? ऑप्टिक गैंग्लियन, सबमैंडिबुलर गैंग्लियन और एक कौन सा गैंग्लियन? सबमैंडिबुलर गैंग्लियन पढ़ लिया आपने. नाउ टेरिगोपेलेटाइन गैंग्लियन. Location, roots and distribution of pterygopalatine ganglion. So number first point, it is largest parasympathetic peripheral ganglion. It is the largest parasympathetic peripheral ganglion located in the pterygopalatine fossa, hanging from the maxillary nerve by two roots. By its hanging from maxillary nerve by two ganglionic branches. Actually, it is topographically related with maxillary nerve. Pterygopalatine ganglion is topographically related with maxillary nerve. Its roots are parasympathetic root from greater petrosal nerve, sympathetic root from sympathetic plexus around internal carotid artery through the deep petrosal nerve, and sensory root from maxillary nerve. So इसकी कौन कौन सी रूट रहती है बेटा, ये याद रखना पड़ेगा आपको. पैरासिम्पैथेटिक रूट फ्रॉम ग्रेटर पेट्रोसल नर्व. आपने जो ऑटिक गैंग्लियन पढ़ा था उसमें कौन सी पेट्रोसल नर्व पड़ी थी? लेसर पेट्रोसल नर्व. यहाँ पर कौन सी पेट्रोसल नर्व है? ग्रेटर पेट्रोसल नर्व. पैरासिम्पैथेटिक रूट ऑफ दी pterygopalatine ganglion is greater petrosal nerve, and sympathetic root is from sympathetic plexus around internal carotid artery through deep petrosal nerve, and sensory root from maxillary nerve. The distribution of its branches is as follows. Parasympathetic fibers supply lacrimal gland, nasal gland and palatine glands. पैरासिम्पैथेटिक फाइबर्स का डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन होता है टेरिकोपैलेटाइन गैंग्लियन का. वो सप्लाई करता है लेक्राइमल ग्लैंड को, नेजल ग्लैंड को और पैलेटाइन ग्लैंड्स को. सिंपैथेटिक फाइबर्स आर वेसोमोटर फाइबर्स टू म्यूकस मेम्ब्रेन्स ऑफ नोज, पेरानेजल एयर साइनसेस एंड नेसोफेरिंक्स. Sympathetic fibers, as you know, they are vasomotor, means they are vasoconstrictor, and to mucous membrane of nose, पेरानेजल एयर साइनसेस. अभी पढ़ा हमने पेरानेजल एयर साइनसेस. सो टेरिगोपेलेटाइन गैंग्लियन की जो सिंपैथेटिक फाइबर्स रहते हैं वो पेरानेजल एयर साइनसेस को भी सप्लाई करते हैं. पेरानेजल एयर साइनसेस मींस वही एफईएमएस, फ्रंटल इथमोइडल मैक्सिलरी एंड स्फिनोइडल, एंड नेसोफेरिंक्स. Sympathetic fibers are vasomotor fibers to mucous membrane of nose, paranasal air sinuses and nasopharynx. And sensory root provides sensory innervation to periosteum of orbit, mucous membrane of nose, palate and pharynx. Nasopharynx. Sensory root maxillary nerve. Sympathetic root from sympathetic plexus around internal carotid artery, and parasympathetic root from greater petrosal nerve. Sensory root from maxillary nerve. So sensory root provides sensory innervation to periosteum of orbit, mucous membrane of nose, palate and pharynx. The distribution of different types of fibers from ganglion takes place through the following branches: orbital branches of the ganglion, nasal branches of the ganglion, palatine branches of the ganglion and pharyngeal branches of the ganglion. कौन कौन सी branches है ganglion की? Orbital branches of the ganglion, nasal branches of the ganglion, palatine branches of the ganglion and pharyngeal branches of the ganglion. Now topographically this ganglion is related to maxillary nerve, but functionally this ganglion is related to facial nerve. Thank you.